Project 2025 Part 2.
And there was always this suspicion of centralized authority, because if the authority is centralized, that means that my individual rights and individual liberty could be trampled upon. So whatever I want is why I need liberty. It doesn't matter if what I want is either for or against biblical principles. The biblical principles are that which is worn by those who use those biblical principles when they are convenient to be used. This is the foundation of this country. Okay, so that's where it started, the founding era, 1776 through 1789. In the course of that, those colonies end up becoming states, as we all know. And that's where that same concept of individual liberty and freedom then gets applied to the individual states, because that's where those with the power live. They live in these regions like Virginia, or like Vermont, or like New York, or New Amsterdam, whatever the region was. Those individuals there did not want people in other regions telling them what to do. So that's where the whole notion of states' rights actually has its root in individual liberty. But the individuals that are at liberty are those who have the power to have liberty. They either have the money or they have the military, and sometimes both. The religious piece comes along later. So we're talking about now in the 1800s. So that's what's going on. Now, there was always a different thread. There was from the inception of the country, there were people who actually did believe Scripture. There were people, because what Scripture actually says is that there are godly standards by which all human beings have been created, and all human beings should be held accountable to. The Native Americans knew that. There were the people who came over here a little bit later to work the land. They knew that. So there was always another thread, which goes back to there's always been the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. What I spent a few minutes talking about was the result of the seed of the serpent and its impact on the beginning of this nation. Okay, so sometimes the opposition was weak, sometimes the opposition was a little bit stronger, but it was always in opposition to the major Edomite Esau mind, which was always the strongest. That opposition found its way all the way into the mid 1900s. But even during that time, between the 1800s and the mid 1900s, I guess what I'm trying to say is all human beings have a conscience. Everybody knows right from wrong. We're talking, however, about when the knowledge of what is right and what is wrong is eclipsed by greed and avarice and lust for power. So I'm saying all that to say any of the advances in this country's quote unquote moral character came from people who had a relationship with the Most High. So that was always here in this country as a witness. What I'm suggesting to you, though, is that it was never the prevailing thread of the nation. It was always that still small voice. Now, sometimes the voice gets louder. And so when the voice gets louder, that's when you hear things like, we shouldn't allow 8 and 9-year-olds to work in factories and get their hands chopped off. So let's come up with something that's more humane We can still make money, but we don't have to make it that way. Let's allow the people who are working for these moneyed people to at least be able to afford a chicken or so that they can eat and have enough strength to come to the factory or to go into the mines. So that's the concept of what we call the New Deal. But the opposition to it was always, well, we won't make as much money if we do that. So those two threads are still being dealt with. So coming further down, in order to keep order, let's go back to when there was slavery. The way that the slave masters kept order was they started hiring poor whites to oversee the black people that were enslaved. And so if a slave were to run off, it was a poor white that would go and find them and drag them back. Or the poor white was the person on the horse with the whip, or the poor white was, you get the picture. All right. So that's how we got a strong military. That's how we got a strong state police force. It was all designed to keep those who had the money, those who had the power, as comfortable as they felt that they wanted to be, because they were in the minority. Okay. When this country was in the antebellum period, there were some locations where people of African descent greatly outnumbered the landowners. So the landowners needed a way to have absolute control. They used those poor whites to do that. The poor whites are always populating the military because they get something out of it as well. They get status, because as long as there's somebody underneath them, that makes them feel good. Now, those poor whites also came from the highlands of England, or from some of those hamlets in Germany, or some of the other Northern European countries. So that's how they got here. But they were brought here to perpetuate the system that already existed. So it's within that context then, when you get to the mid 20th century, when again that voice of humanity was crying out, you shouldn't treat people poorly because of the color of their skin, or you shouldn't create ghettos for those people to live in and only give them certain resources. You shouldn't do that. That is not humane. Okay. But there were always people who said, we can do whatever we want to do because we have the power. That is the history of the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation, even in 1973, was of that mind from its inception. But its inception was only an extension of how the elite in the United States of America have been operating since the country was founded. It's all about pro-capitalism. They say it's pro-family, but whose family are they pro? Their family. It's anti-bureaucracy, because if you put a bureaucracy in place, it's more unwieldy, and sometimes it won't do what you want it to do. And it certainly was anti-communistic, because although the Christian community in Acts lived in a much more communal way, no one considered anything that they had to belong to him or herself. It belonged to the group, and it was distributed to the group by those who were godly people as each one had need. That is the antithesis of the United States of America. But that is one of the core principles of true Christianity. So classical American conservatism was created by and for the powerful elite. It was that way then, it's that way now, and that's how we got to Project 2025. Now, to rehearse some of what this looked like, again, in the Revolutionary era, the early Republic, the human piece or the promotion of humanity could be found in the northern states, beginning with abolishing slavery, or the notion that slavery was not a good thing. Starting in the 1780s, uh, a number of northern states like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts did pass gradual emancipation laws. And at the same time, in 1787, when all of these elites come together to make laws that are always going to benefit them first, they came up with the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution that not only recognized, it protected slavery. And that's where the 3/5 compromise was a part of all of those discussions. Okay, that's also, we're going to come back to this, that's also where the fugitive slave clause was being formulated. And in 1793, there was this Fugitive Slave Act that allowed for the capture and return of runaway enslaved people, and that was primarily targeting the free states, because what was going on, you remember Harriet Tubman, okay, the Underground Railroad, you remember all of those examples, which is why they want to take this out of the true history of the United States of America. But you remember that the Underground Railroad was to take enslaved people who had run away and bring them into freed lands. The Fugitive Slave Act was the way that the ruling class could get their money back. So again, they used poor whites to run and get those slaves, and gave them the power to even go into northern states as far north as Massachusetts and drag people back into slavery. It didn't matter if they were freedmen or not. If their skin was dark, they were subject to be drugged back into slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act. Okay, now we go to the antebellum period, the 1820s through the 1860s. Again, that still small voice of the people who were not the elite, overwhelmingly, began to see that slavery was not good. And so an abolitionist movement began to grow. It increased during this time. There were several people whose names are written here, but I'm just going to read some of these. Are white people, by the way. William Lloyd Garrison. He published The Liberator, a radical anti-slavery newspaper. He was the co-founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he advocated for immediate emancipation and racial equality. Some of you may remember Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a riff, if you will, on an actual human being that was anything but an Uncle Tom. But in any case, so she wrote this anti-slavery novel that began to galvanize Northern sentiment against slavery. The work among whites did what it was supposed to do, which was to put a human face on those who were enslaved, rather than them being seen as they had been up to this point as only beasts. We have to understand that in order to keep a people enslaved, you have to dehumanize them. And so that is what was done. And so a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin, targeting a white audience, assisting in the effort of humanizing my ancestors. Okay. And then, of course, people know about John Brown, who was a militant abolitionist, and he believed in using whatever means necessary to end slavery, including military efforts. He led a raid in 1859 on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His attempt was to spark an uprising, because just as on the right, chaos is used to make changes, he saw the same thing using that creating a chaotic situation so that the change of being anti-slavery could take hold. There's another person by the name of Theodore Weld. He was a lecturer and a writer. He helped write American Slavery as It Is, and that was actually a key source that Harriet Beecher Stowe used for Uncle Tom's Cabin. Garrett Smith was a wealthy philanthropist
who used his resources to support abolitionist causes.
He supported the Underground Railroad. So if you wanted to know how the Underground Railroad was able to last as long as it did, there was money behind it. Okay. So not everybody who had money was an evil person. Lydia Maria Child, another author and editor, she wrote extensively on slavery and civil rights. She wrote an appeal in favor of that class of Americans called Africans. She wrote that in 1833. Elijah Lovejoy had a abolitionist newspaper. He was killed by a pro-slavery mob in Illinois in 1837. So those were some of the white abolitionists. There certainly were black abolitionists as well, and most of us know about Frederick Douglass, who was formerly enslaved and became free. He was an orator. He was a writer. He was an editor of an anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. He wrote the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, in 1845, which exposed the realities of slavery to a wider audience. So he was involved. Sojourner Truth, we know that name. She was born into slavery in New York, and she gained her freedom and became a powerful speaker against slavery as well as for women's rights. Henry Highland Garnett was an abolitionist minister and orator who urged enslaved people to rise up in rebellion against their enslavers in his famous Call to Rebellion speech in 1843. He was more militant than Frederick Douglass, and he promoted immediate action and self-liberation. In other words, he promoted the idea that the Most High's people should liberate themselves. Okay, so there was a lot happening in this antebellum period in a positive way. In the negative way, the Dred Scott decision, going back to the Supreme Court. See, the elite have always had the law on their side. They have always made sure that the people who run the country are working for them and their interest. This did not start with private money going into the electoral system. This country was founded on that principle. All right, that principle being whoever has the goal makes the rules. It's a very simple principle that this country has been focusing its efforts on since its inception. So the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans were not and could not be citizens of the United States. Please pay attention to this because it's on the table again. It's just disguised differently. Now people are being told, well, if you're a criminal, we can take away your citizenship rights. That's what this the top of the government is mouthing. The top of the government did not write Project 2025. Those who work for the elite businessmen wrote Project 2025. Getting back to the antebellum period, black codes and disenfranchisement. So the southern states began to restrict the freedoms of black people and again, deny them legal protections. That's how things are always worked whether you're talking about the United States of America, whether you're talking about the invasion of Africa in the late 1800s, or even earlier than that in after 1492, when the Spanish and the Portuguese began to get inroads, and the Dutch began to get inroads into West Africa and South Africa. They always used legislation, and the premier initiator was the Pope. The Pope would write papal bulls, empowering people like Columbus to go take whatever land, whatever resources existed if the people weren't Christians. That's part of the history. Okay. So the Black Codes and the disenfranchisement was historically familiar to those who run this country. Then we get to the Civil War and Reconstruction. The Emancipation Proclamation, everybody knows about that abolished slavery in the states where the North had not taken over yet. So it was more a military tactic than a tactic that was based on it's time to free those who are enslaved. The 14th Amendment in 1868, the 15th Amendment in 1870, the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship and equal protection. So one of the things that people are saying now, the same people that wrote Project 2025, what they're saying now is, well, those amendments were amendments. That's not a part of the original Constitution. We need to go back to the original Constitution where they had no rights. Okay. See, these are the things that are going on. And this is the history of how they got to that place. Extraordinary effort went into the 14th and the 15th Amendments, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875, because those acts granted civil rights to people who had recently obtained their freedom. But as soon as that happened, then especially in the southern states, laws were being passed that made vagrancy, for instance, a crime that you could be put in jail with. There were lots of African Americans, people of African descent, who could not find work. And so where else are they going to be? They're on the streets. They get arrested, and then the convict leasing concept came into play, which was merely a reintroduction into slavery. So almost as soon as the Civil Rights Act was passed, then the Reconstruction period began to dismantle all of those things. And then, of course, out of that rose the Jim Crow laws. The southern states enacted laws enforcing segregation, and therefore, once again, disenfranchising Black people and Black voters. One of the things, it was really important to people who had just come out of slavery. They were not dumb people. That's another myth. They were highly intelligent, and their intelligence told them the only way we can try to ensure some degree of normalcy in our lives is we have to put the right people in charge of writing the laws so that we can have some sort of legal protection. So that's why voting was so important to them. And that's why these Jim Crow laws did everything that they could to make sure that voting did not occur. Because when voting did occur, the needs of those who were formerly enslaved were being addressed in a meaningful way. But that was upsetting the time-honored tradition of slavery. So it had to be stopped. And that's where this Jim Crow era took place. Now, the way you stop it is either through legislation or the military. The military doesn't always have to have on a uniform. Well, actually, it did have uniforms. That's what a Ku Klux Klan robe is. But it doesn't always have to be a robed individual, because again, those individuals were all a part of citizens' councils that had to do with the business class in each one of those respective areas. So they empowered, again, poor whites to go out and lynch people under the guise of them being lawbreakers. And what is the most egregious law that they would break? Well, it was the one that the white slave owners routinely did, which was to rape black women that were on their plantations. But they didn't want they didn't want the opposite to happen. So the most egregious thing that could happen was if a white woman and a black man got together. So anytime there was confusion, the thing that got the most negative energy was he raped her. There were lots of instances where people were being told that a white woman's honor had been compromised by some black person, and therefore that black person had to be killed. Now, that was the excuse. The real reason those things happen is because anytime the Most High's people are given an ounce of stability, they begin to thrive. That's what was happening. The so-called black community, the farmers were producing, those who saw how the labor market worked, they began to take advantage of that. They were becoming a threat to these business people. And so most of the lynchings, or much of the lynching that went on, had to do with making sure that people who were doing well would be stopped, and that other people who saw them being stopped wouldn't try to do the same thing. So in other words, terror was used. The terror excuse was rape. The real issue was, you all are doing too well. We have to stop that. So we will kill you. And they did. And so it was from those kinds of experiences that groups like the NAACP found traction, trying to address things like that. There were several court victories, like Quinn versus the United States, which struck down the grandfather clauses used to prevent black voting, for instance. So that was in 1915. So there, even in the Jim Crow era, there were some victories. But with every victory, there's always pushback from the elites. And I have to keep saying that so that people understand this is not just ignorant people not understanding that black people are human beings. These people knew who black people were. They knew the power in the black community. That's why they attacked it then. That's why they're attacking it now. So the denial piece, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, again, legalized racial segregation under separate but equal. Because if you separate people, then wherever they're separated, you can control them better. You can make laws. You can send the poor people that are charged with containing those people. They're all in the same area. Okay. So that's how it happened. No, I'll go ahead and mention that now. That's where this idea of redlining came in. Redlining in housing or redlining in bank loans has its genesis in the Jim Crow era, and it's for the specific purpose of keeping people disenfranchised. That's why it's there. So Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, systemic disenfranchisement, literacy tests, poll taxes, white primaries. In other words, once the ruling class understood these people have caught on to our system, we have to stop them. So in order to be registered to vote, you have to write out the 10th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. You have to read this document that most white people can't even read. And if you can't do that, then we won't let you vote. Poll taxes. You got to pay us a certain amount of money if you want to register to vote. Okay. And it's certainly white only primaries. And the tried and true widespread racial violence, including lynchings, race massacres. Most people don't know that most of the race riots in the United States of America prior to the 60s were all initiated by white people against black people, not vice versa. And that happened in East St. Louis. It happened in St. Louis. It happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which most people know. It happened in Chicago. It happened in Springfield, Illinois. It happened in Atlanta, Georgia. These were all the militaristic tactics of keeping people disenfranchised. And it's